Yeah, shall I just start?
Yeah, do that.
Okay. So, so this the title of this came from a conversation with Zoe Blackler at Kairos, who said, "Oh, maybe you'd want to do a session at Kairos on commoning," and I said, "Yes, I would, but I don't know what exactly I would do." And she wants it to be a 45-minute talk, and they don't record it, and so there's no slides. So it was hard to think about. But what I came up with was um, a thought that I could peg uh, where I'm thinking about commons now, how I'm thinking about commons and commoning now, onto things I've experienced uh, in my life that I've done that I think were commoning experiences, even though I didn't know it at the time. And so the way, so that's what this creating and learning and making and failing and designing and building is. There's a one way of describing a sequence of events. I mean, it's not a map of, it's not a life story or anything like that. And so, but what's happened when I've actually sat down and tried to structure this is what I realized I needed to do was do a bit of a preamble, which sets up some lenses through which to look at those experiences, which means I might have too many experiences written down to go through them all. And so I'm going to do the first bit. So, commoning. I'm going to try and do something to tell a story of how I've arrived at commoning as what I think is the thing I want to spend my life doing, one way or another. What's left of it, pegged to things I've experienced. And there are some themes that I think are worth tracing through. And so I'd like to set those out and get those in people's heads. So, but before that, the basis of it all, I think, is increasingly what people do all the time, when they are together, or being together at least, uh, can be seen as commoning. It's almost all informal, it's almost all unacknowledged, but as soon as you see it that way, it's very hard to unsee it. And of course, people will have other definitions of commoning, but if you will do me the favor of letting that be the basis of this conversation and give it a try, that would be good. So, commoning as a verb, as very distinct from the noun commons as things. I think that's becoming more and more important to me, the distinction. In the first place, I think we called the Festival of Commoning that rather than the Festival of the Commons, just because I didn't want to fight with people about what commons meant. But actually, the character of a verb, I think, is super important, and I'll get to that a bit more. So, okay, so if we try and start with that and say, what is commoning? What's my definition that I would like you to bear with? Whatever. Okay, doing something, collaborating, that's the thing they're doing, voluntarily, so people doing something, should have said, collaborating voluntarily to build some value which is dependent upon their collaboration, which they could not make alone by themselves. And you could add to that, and which would be different if there were different people collaborating, but I'm trying to keep it simple. So it's an active thing, it's voluntary, it's building some value which would be unattainable without that collaborating. Further, and this I think is what ends up making something that one might end up calling a commons, that value has a character such that it is significantly diminished if anyone tries to own it or even if they say that together they exclusively own it. So, and this, I think, as I say, applies everywhere. So, a conversation is a commoning activity. This call is a commoning activity. A platoon in an army is a commoning activity. An evening in a nightclub, I think, is a commoning activity. A political party is a commoning activity. They're not all the same. They're not all as healthy or as unhealthy. The commoning is just so widespread, so ubiquitous that it isn't even necessarily a good thing. It's just what humans do. It's like, is the air a good thing? Well, I mean, it's just where we live. There's good air, bad air, better air, worse air, times when you need this sort of air, times when you need that sort of air. It's just air. Commoning is what humans do. So I think I'll stop there and just see if that's landed. So, yeah.
So what I'm going to do is to do a round, which will be quite simple. So to ask in my portrait gallery in a round, if first of all you have any questions to clarify what it is for you that Dil has said. And Katya, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, what comes up for me is if people do commenting, is that then also a comment? So from what you said, probably not. And I wonder what the difference is. Maybe there is not always a resource involved with commenting. Another thing I've been thinking about is I think that was Massimo De Angelis, who said that the family is a mini commons. And that always struck me as well. And on the whole, I think I've had similar thought that like commenting happens a lot. Yeah. Yeah, the platoon, I was wondering about that because I don't know how platoons work, but I thought that there was a hierarchy, but maybe in the platoon itself, not. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
So, Sue, I'm going to take direction from you. Should I collect all the questions and then come back in one blob at the end, or shall I do them?
I would suggest you go individually because I think
Okay.
that will be helpful and you might end up answering someone's question on the way.
Okay, right. So your first thought, Katja, was if people do commenting, does that automatically make a commons? And I would say no. And we'll see more later that I get more and more convinced that it's the active social process that is commoning, not the value that results. And at the same time, accept that humans will always prefer to use a noun than a verb because it's cognitively cheaper. It's much easier to talk about a brick than talk about the process of digging up clay, forming it into a cuboid shape, baking it at a high temperature. A brick connotes all that sort of stuff very cheaply. So as soon as a commoning activity produces some recognizable value that persists in time and space, people are likely to end up labeling that as a commons. But this call might produce a recording which we could make public under some commons license, and that might be a commons. But this call is a living thing and it isn't a commons yet. It's just a commoning activity. That's my take on that point. And I guess we probably haven't got time for secondaries, so I'm just going to hope that that's okay and move on.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. So this idea of family as mini commons, there was a whole section I was going to do for this thing that I decided not to, was to start characterizing commons as enforced commons, as voluntary commons, as corrupted commons, as enclosed commons, all sorts of, and in the end I just ended up saying that thing I said a bit before. Commons are like air. If you subscribe to my notion that almost all human social activity could be described as commoning of a sort, and therefore the categorization of types of air and types of commons could go on forever. A family is a odd one because there's so much social pressure that your participation in it may or may not, you didn't ask to be born for a start. Your parents chose you, you didn't choose them. You didn't even choose life. So there are aspects of a family as a commons which are unique and strange, I would say. So it's a dodgy version of a commons, I think, to base anything on.
Thanks very much, Dil. That's great.
Well, I have one more, just the platoon one, and it's very short, which is, I'm not a student of this at all, but from what I'm aware of social science and studying soldiers, is what causes soldiers to risk their lives or even basically commit suicide is the family unit that a platoon becomes. They're not dying for king or country or flag or a cause. In the end, they're risking their lives for the people that they depend upon to keep them alive, and they value that. So the process of making a platoon is, by my definition, which needs only last the length of this call if you don't like it, is commoning.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Katja. So, Chick, you're the next person. You need to unmute. Do you have any questions or comments on that part?
On the previous one, so identity fusion is a fairly new strand of identity theory that validates that idea of a small unit as being the driver of quite a lot of extreme behavior in human beings. I think you made it quite clear on the voluntary, which I had a question mark on. It's just that that person has the agency and the drive. It doesn't mean to do it without payment, right?
Oh, 100%. Yes. Yeah. For instance, if we think of a family, a grumpy teenager can just stop collaborating, or they can actively disrupt. So if they don't, and also if we think of the platoon, if you've ever read Good Soldier Schweik, it's perfectly possible, or seen Sergeant Bilko, it's perfectly possible for someone to be a soldier and completely not build what the army wants them to build. It's very, very hard. Even under torture, you don't actually inhabit the brain of somebody. They're not collaborating with you. You might be able to force them to do all sorts of things, but it's not collaboration. So unless it's voluntary at some level. Now, this is why I got into the idea of corrupted commons, because people do collaborate to form a platoon in an army that they might be an unwilling conscript in, because they have no choice. So there are points where the human need for building connection, the human automatic habit of commoning together, brings them into a voluntary commoning process, which is in some extractive or destructive context, and that's really how things get corrupted.
Thanks very much, Dil. Dave.
I just wanted to ask a question about the concept of ownership or lack of. And I know that if we had a few houses in the housing commons, people are going to ask who owns the houses. And I don't think saying nobody is going to satisfy them. They're going to say, who's got the title deeds? And then the answer will be, well, the Stroud Housing Commons organisation or the Steward Group or whoever we decide how holds the title deeds. And so as far as the world is concerned, I think they're going to think whoever holds the title deeds owns the houses.
Yes, that has to be the case. And we'll come to this business of putting to the forefront the active social process as the thing. I think that's probably the way to deal with that. I mean, there's no way we can not, control houses without having something in the land registry if you're in the UK at the moment. So, but we can act to make that, as far as possible, just a piece of paper that lets us get on with doing things the way we want to get on with doing them.
Okay, although I'm facilitating today, I'm actually going to
Please do. There's not exactly a big audience.
In that case, I'm grateful. What I'm noticing, and partly it's because of my work for, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades in the community, what I'm noticing is one of the things that I hear as missing, I'm sure it isn't, but I hear it as missing, is about power or agency. And I think that's really important because my experience is that the way we've been wired, literally, the way we've been wired as humans from birth onwards, and in fact, it's probably from conception onwards, particularly how we're schooled within a European, American, and so on views. So often what we do is we give our power, our agency away. We in effect, what we do is we say, no, mummy and daddy should do it. The community should do it, or the government should do it, or the council should do it. And in commoning, and I'm changing my language around this, it's not about rules and regulations, it's about rights and responsibilities. And increasingly people are bleating, and I use that word particularly, bleating like sheep about their rights, but actually not taking on their responsibilities. And in commoning, I think that's an issue which maybe we could bring forward and hopefully helps us change our mindset about, I'm not going to use the word ownership because that's a European thing and there are lots of different cultures in the world, but about our responsibility for how we go forward in some kind of a way. I don't know if that's helpful, and Francois just joining us.
So what I'm going to do is just rehearse the definition of commoning that we've just explored, and that will be a good basis so I can do that in a few seconds, and then we can move on. So this is saying I'm wanting to use the word commoning, and I'm wanting to define, at least for the purposes of this call, this conversation, and ask you to take it as if true, even if it doesn't quite sit. Commoning is doing something, collaborating. That's the thing of doing, collaborating voluntarily, and thanks, Chick, in the sense of willing, not without pay, to build some value which is dependent upon that collaboration, which the participants could not make by themselves. And further, that the value they produce has a character such that would be significantly diminished if any of them tried to own the value, or even if they said that together they exclusively owned that value. And I'm saying that commoning is a fundamental human social behavior. People do it all the time whenever they're together. So I'm saying a conversation is a commoning, this call is a commoning, a platoon in an army relies upon commoning. A political party is a commoning, and there are all sorts of commons, and they're not necessarily, or there are all sorts of commoning practices. They don't all produce commons as nouns, and there's not a lot of point trying to write down the list of types of commoning activities because it is a ubiquitous human behavior. But okay, now I'm going to break that definition out a bit and say a bit more. So voluntary, and this speaks to your point, Sue, these are individuals with some agency making relatively free choices. And here again is something that came up before. Even if you control someone completely, you can't force them to join in with a value creation conversation, a collaborative value creation conversation. You know, you can be torturing someone, you can get some information out of them, but you're not going to jointly create value. You might force something. And another example I use is a recalcitrant teenager can completely refuse to join in with building the family unit. So in commoning, we have individuals with individual drives coming together to create something which adds value for each of them. They wouldn't be there if they weren't feeling like they were going to get some value according to them from the collaboration. So that's the individuals with agency, why they're there. The next point is they're making something that none of them could do alone. And I haven't got much elaboration on that until later, and then there's quite a chunky bit on that later. And then the impossibility of ownership, which is a radical distinction from property rights as generally conceived of in the West, sort of, you know, the modern state, all that sort of stuff. And people will always, when they can, I said this before, I'll say it again, reify things when they can. By reify, I mean turn something that might have been a verb or a description of a process into a nice cheap noun. And the example I gave before was it's much easier to say brick than it is to say pieces of clay that you dig up and carefully refine and form into a cuboid shape and bake in an oven until it partly vitrified as a building material. We just say brick. And all of those other things are nicely connoted. So it's much cheaper to say brick. But commoning, if it's a ubiquitous human activity, as I propose, doesn't always produce something which has persistence across time or millions of instances or a persistence in place. Whenever it does, though, it's going to get called a commons if it's that sort of a thing. And as soon as it's a thing, then certainly in the West, people will start to think about property rights and ownership, even if we would rather they didn't. So to counter this is taking seriously that commoning is a verb and situating the commoning as the important thing, an active living social process. Whether or not it produces something which someone can point at and say, that's the commons, if we understand that it will be the death of the commons, or at least a diminishment of the commons, if the active living social process is attempted to be owned or considered to be property. And I was going to write, it's impossible to own such a thing, but actually Facebook did enclose upon people's conversations in a incredibly powerful way. So even calling something an active living social process, and that's hard to enclose, doesn't mean that enclosing it will kill it and make people leave. So the proposition here, which sort of makes sense of the definition of commoning, I guess, is that what commoning really does, what the underlying pro-social thing about it does, is it connects individuals in satisfying their particular individual desires into a collaborative pro-social relationship with other individuals. In other words, commoning is what builds society. So that's why it's ubiquitous. Society would not exist without, whether you call it commoning or not, without that ubiquitous, persistent, unquenchable, unstoppable human process, human urge. So I think I'll stop again and see if there's any unpacking of that. I think there's only one more section like this before I get onto the fun stuff.
Francois, do you want any questions for clarification or any comments?
Yeah, I'm a little bit intrigued by this notion of impossibility of ownership. Ownership, well, because what about the commons itself? For example, a common itself can own what is produced. So I would have thought. So, for example, thinking of small communities like a village or whatever, it might produce something of value, which it perceives as being a common ownership amongst the community. But to the external world, wouldn't they regard it as being ownership? So I'm intrigued by this impossibility thing, and why is it important? Why is the impossibility element of it important? That's sort of my. I'm not sure what the question is exactly, but it's the area I'm a bit unclear about. Intrigued by.
Okay. Firstly, I probably said the word impossible out loud. Oh no, I have written impossibility, and that is an inconsistency. What I said earlier on was that the value has a character such that it would be significantly diminished by the exertion of strong property rights. So I resile from impossibility. Non-desirability, shall we say, is a weaker statement. But secondly, I still do hold that the extent to which that village claims property rights over, let's say, the food which their commoning activities have produced is a diminishment. It's not a destruction of the social value of that. This is social value. We're talking about human value, not money value. Of course, that probably should have been stated. For instance, if the next door village has had a calamity and their crops have been burnt, then you can, strong property rights would suggest, oh, right, they're going to pay a high price for our food now. Great. You know, their gold didn't burn. Let's have all their gold because they'll starve to death. They'll surely give us all their gold. And that would be a diminishment of the future prospects of the village that's got all the food, because tit for tat, next year when their harvest fails, someone else is going to do that to them. So ownership is a diminishment of the value produced by the process of commoning, is the claim that I'm making. I hope that helps.
Is that okay to move on, Francois?
Yeah, I mean, I could come back, but yes, let's move on.
Okay. Chris, you're next in the round.
Well, I could talk for an hour on this, but I won't.
Thank you.
But just to say this, that and it was the sort of insight I had over a decade ago, that it was Jeremy Bentham, who's sitting there to this day in UCL, who pointed out that property is actually not a thing, as Dil points out, but is a relationship between essentially a subject. There's a subject relationship object here. It's universal, and he pointed out that it is the relationship between the person and that which is the object of his property. So what he said was it's this thing that is the object of or something which is proper to the man. Okay, this is what he said, that it is an object that is proper to the man. And and therefore it is a relationship, it's a bundle of rights. And this is where I got my sort of non-dominion thinking from, of the rights of use, the fruits of use, the rights of of stewardship, if you will. And the key one, I think, which is where the community comes in, is this. And I was having this conversation very recently with in relation to the custodian and whether that's a proper word, and maybe there is a better word that we should be thinking about for the role of the community as a group. Something that is held in common. And I'll stop at that. But that is, that's where my thinking got to, and that four-party relationship, I believe, is a universal, potential, viable system. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm also going to make a quick contribution, and then Chick, if I'll ask you because you were away for the round. So, firstly, I found that really helpful, Dil, Francois, and Chris, because I have to use examples in order to understand words. And I'm thinking about the place in where I'm living and wanting to enable someone else to be present with me in it, and thinking of the old kind of terms of renting, selling, all that kind of thing. And what I want is joint responsibility. And what I mean by that is I want the other person to get something out of this that they want. I want myself to get what I want out of it. Plus, I want the property to get what it needs. And so that makes me understand a little bit better, though not necessarily to put the words that make sense to other people, but they make sense to me, which is what helps. So, Chick, do you have any questions or comments to clarify or add to this part of the conversation?
I think the one thing that maybe just the comment is that the word pro-social collaborative processes, this is often used in OICD's work as well. So we talk a lot about how weaponization of identities and cultures degrade the pro-social context towards violent action, and that OICD's work is really at trying to build that cultural context in which pro-social activities can manifest. And so there's a lot of, I think I've been sort of working on how this will work together with commons as a separate thing. But what Dil, I think you've highlighted this, is that it's actually the work I'm doing with OICD is commoning. that
Exactly.
is
Yes.
all part of the same kind of package, but labeled differently, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, I think we'll get to more on that. Thank you. Right, I'm going to crash on. So this is all there's a slight disjoint here. But it refers back to I think what you were saying. So collaboration takes work, and the work is the assumption of responsibility. People accept responsibility, and that therefore there's some requirement upon them, and that's the only possible payback for that is value, which was otherwise unattainable. And people might reject this quid pro quo relationship. People talk about gift economy and things like that. Well, a gift economy might be a value to you that would be otherwise unobtainable without giving something away. The value is not monetary value. The value could be an extraordinarily high level value that some particular individual participant or a group of participants could jointly subscribe to. So it's still a value that is derived from that collaborative work. And I'm very strong, this is the basis of human society. This willingness to accept responsibility for the process of building something that one could not attain alone. Since it's everywhere, under my definition, at all time, at all scales, it manifests in a million different ways. Just one nice, cute example, as David Graeber pointed out, the biggest secret of capitalist organizations is that they operate communism internally, because anything else would be insane. And there's a whole load of economics on that. The theory of the firm. The economist's name's gone out of my head. Someone will have it. You don't pay rent for your desk. Your boss does not rent his team to the department. The stationery cupboard is not set up as a shop. A capitalist organisation is a commons of some kind then, even though we have serious criticisms of the outcomes when society organises itself along those lines. So that's again saying that commoning is not a universally lovely thing. We need to ask what sort of commoning, under what circumstances, what sort of commons are produced. So it'd be foolish to set out, define, or invent, or reinvent, or renew commoning as we believe or hope it ought to be or could be. If we accept this, that it's a basic hardwired human sociality mechanic urge, then all we can do is hope to configure some novel commoning contexts, which may, if we're lucky and pay attention and take responsibility, be more pro-social than other ones. Which means that what we are actually about in this pro-commoning world, where we all partake of in one way or another, is design. That's the meta action that we're part of, the meta activity. Design in its broadest sense, not making beautiful this, that's, or the others, or clever doohickeys, but design. And I've trained and spent a long time being a designer, so I'm still quite happy with this definition. I'm not even going to try and say, believe me, please. I'm going to tell you, it's design is that human capacity which is innate but can also be developed, trained for, refined, practiced. The ability, the capacity to propose into a complex context. That's one where the law of unintended consequences is the only certain law. Proper complex context, to propose into such context with an optimal balance of efficiency of effort versus reliability of outcome. Now that's a lot to unpack, but basically, when, say, because I did architecture, an architect designs a building, they're proposing an incredibly complex intervention into the fabric of the city, let's say, or the fabric of that bit of nature if it's in the countryside, and they don't have time to build 15 prototypes and test this, that, or the other. They've actually got to build a building, but the impact on the context of a building is enormous. Over time, as a huge lump, as a damage to, or at least a radical restructuring of certain parts of what's there already. So if you're a good designer, what you're capable of is proposing an intervention into that complex setting, which you cannot quite ever predict. It's not a machine where you can see what all the parts are. It's a living complex entity that changes over time and will respond to the building that is built in unpredictable ways. So if you're a good designer, you can make propositions into complexity relatively cheaply that are relatively high quality. That's the capacity for design. And if we're thinking about designing commons, we need to be thinking about how to design new commoning contexts, new commoning protocols, new commoning habits into a social situation which is much more complex than a city even, much harder to know. But we need to be designing as well as we can with affordable effort, given how small our resources are, for relatively high quality outcomes. So it's the practice of design that we're in for at the moment. And I'm just going to barrel on, I think, with this bit and get through it and then do some questions. So what I'm going to do in whatever's the second half of this call is do something more fun, visit some different commoning contexts that I've had experience of across my life, and invite us all to consider those contexts through a number of lenses. And these are the lenses of design freedom, I think, or some of them. It'd be great. We might well propose some others. But the ones I've got in front of me are the scale of the commoning activity, the commons involved. That could be across time or space. It could be the number of instances. It could be the number of people. Scale changes things dramatically. So scale of commons, I think, or commoning matters. Another lens is formality. The degree to which the understanding of the commoning practice involved is abstracted from the actuality of the practice. So that's a lot of words, but people generally can have conversations without thinking about the rules of conversation or how to have a good conversation. If you were in the court of the Sun King in Versailles, you probably were not in that thing. You were probably incredibly, or wish you were incredibly highly trained in the art of conversation to be able to survive in that milieu. But generally, people just strike up conversations without referring to abstract guides. On the other hand, when we do a housing commons, if we haven't got an abstract formalization of what that commons is, we're cruising for a bruising. So there's a degree of formality that is variable across different commoning contexts. And I've said you could also describe that formality as acknowledgement. In other words, you might enter into some commons, you're just commoning, you're just chatting, you're just turning up to this call and think it'll be fun. You might be inducted into the army and have no bloody choice. But there are other commoning things where you acknowledge the rules of the space or the culture of the space or the habits of the space or the aims of the engagement beforehand in a formal way. So scale, formality, characterizing the interdependence. Now, this is where we get to what you were talking about, Chick. I've talked a lot about material interdependence and in some places as a without which not, a sine qua non for the ability to stand up a commoning experience. And if we talk about material interdependence and we think about the Maslow ladder of needs, Maslow's ladder, material stuff is about the bottom rung, basically, or maybe the bottom two, depending on your definition of materiality. And of course, there are many other rungs on that ladder, and I think there are interdependencies at all layers of existence, some of which might be material and some might not. Like a conversation at the bus stop is not a material interdependence, although you might come away with a slightly raised, somatic feel from having a good one. And oxytocin apparently is what gets people, it used to be known as the love hormone, but they discovered it's also the risk your life for your platoon mates hormone. It's the same deal. So there are interdependencies at various different levels, and material interdependence is probably the one that we're focusing on because we're trying to buy back the world from capitalism. So we need money. So we're talking about leveraging people's materiality that where it's under stress to encourage them to make this effort to join in with commoning, to take the responsibilities that they might have preferred mummy and daddy to do for them. Go and ask your MP for rent controls. No, join the housing commons and have to involve conversations about setting your own rent with people who've got different interests than you about what the level of rent should be. So characterizing the character of the interdependence of the commoning. So, okay, I'm just going to reiterate again, the scale, formality, characterizing the interdependence. And then I've got variety. Variety is a cybernetics term for the quantity of complexity. And there's a load of words I've written here. I'm probably not going to do them, but if anyone knows the Cynefin framework, Dave Snowden, he suggests that there are sort of phase changes of complexity. So there are things which are simple, things which are complicated, things which are complex, things which are chaotic, and that it's not a continuous spectrum. It's more like the phases of matter: solid, liquid, gaseous, plasma. Actually, mostly things fit into some buckets, and the interspace, the liminal space between solid and liquid, is quite narrow and quite specialized, and almost nothing exists there. And I think we might be able to look at commoning in that sort of phase change way, and sort of talk about a range, maybe phases. There's an individual commoning, maybe internal family theory, maybe you're a commons inside yourself. Conversation is a relatively small number of actors. Collaboration is usually persisting over some time in pursuit of some more specified goal than a conversation. Cooperation tends to be even more, we could say that's even more formalized. Collectivization is a particular form of collaboration. Intentional commoning, I'm going to say that's a thing, and federation. So there's sort of these different phases maybe. So the level of variety, the complexity of the commoning activity or the commons to be produced. And there might be anti-patterns of that complexity thing, like incorporation, legal personhood, and statism. Right, okay, that's the end of the theory bit. So I'm going to stop and see if anyone's got any more clarifications that they would like.
Katja, do you want to ask a question?
Possibly. Yeah, it was quite a lot. There was
Sorry, it was. Yeah, I decided not to break it into two. Maybe I should have done.
I think where the most things came up for me were about the formality, because in your example it can be positive, and that is certainly quite true. That if you acknowledge the commons, then it is more difficult to enclose it potentially, or it's very easy to enclose it if people don't even know it's there. And I think that has happened a lot. I mean that is the whole thing maybe in a way. But there was also a part in me that said sometimes making things too formal can also be detrimental in some way. Like you do something naturally, and then when you sort of put too much attention to it, it might become contrived or so. Those were some thoughts I had. Yeah. And some of the other stuff, I think I didn't completely follow it all, but yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Thanks, Katja. My sense is that's where we are. We're not really sure, but we're in the process of finding. Chick.
I actually, sorry, were we not doing
go on.
individual?
Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I just had a response to that. Is that right? We're doing it one per one rather than...
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
So yes, in a sense, what I really want to do is explore, and I think this is also the work that Chris is, spent years and years on, is how can we have institutions, in other words, formalize sets of relationships without them ending up having us, and discovering that by formalizing something, we've become its slave rather than it becoming a context where we make ourselves more alive. And this is, I think, the fundamental question that anyone who calls himself an anarchist seriously has to answer: is how can we have institutions without them having us? And it's a big question. But it's probably a sidestep from this call.
Can I say I don't know where I read that recently, but somebody coined this term "exstitutions."
Right.
I like that. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Chick, do you have any comments or clarification? And you're muted.
I'm still kind of pondering on the material interdependence, and I think it was Bruce's comment about how in certain contexts, like in Kenya, the trade networks break down first before the election, and that they were thinking of whether the economic network activity or the social identity networks are the earliest indicators of division happening, and which would be the first to signal the divisions happening in communities. And so I'm still, I haven't seen enough or read enough or understand it enough to know whether this is this is what binds people together, or whether this is still as fragile as cultural narratives. That would be my question mark at the moment. And the other question mark is more recently, when I came across several research around Maslow's ladder being out, or what's the word for it? That there are more fundamental needs that drive human beings. That if in certain contexts the need for belonging would overpower the need for housing or food, and they would then commit suicide for the group because they want to feel. So in certain contexts, there are sort of the human needs are being sort of shifts. It seems like it's not a strict hierarchical ladder, but quite a malleable thing that seems to change. So those are probably
Okay. Yeah, no, good. So the material interdependence, I'm absolutely with you there. I am, definitely still pushing it in, for instance, in relation to the housing commons. I think, there is I think because we can produce with a housing commons that can be made viable, a really significant material benefit to three different kinds of actor, at least. It's worth doing, but actually it is, you could absolutely criticize it as a homo economicus view of people, that the only thing which will keep them, well, the only thing which will justify them making the effort to build a commons is if they get something physical out of it. I still think there's stuff there, but okay, but that brings us on to the Maslow point. I think that critique of Maslow is rooted in a massive and almost complete now misunderstanding of Maslow. So many people don't even call it a ladder, they call it a pyramid. And they act and talk and write about it, even quite serious people, as if it's a bingo card, as if you cannot possibly have anything further up the pyramid unless you've got a full house at all the lower levels. And that is absolutely not my reading of Maslow at all. It's a ladder. Once you get to the top, people can kick out the bottom rungs and you're still there, which is exactly agreeing with that critique. But it's a failure. It's not a critique of Maslow's proposition. It's a critique of the inadequate messaging about what it means. There's a perfect example. There's a woman called Louise Michel, or my happy example. Louise Michel was one of the sort of main actors, or an important actor in the 1870 Paris Commune revolt. And she was exiled to one of those Papillon-like French penal colonies off Papua New Guinea, just utterly desolate, given no food, just given a bit of land and some canvas, and told to get on with life. And, many of them just died. She managed to not only, so she was, all of her bottom rungs were kicked out viciously. She not only managed to survive, she managed to foment a revolution, a revolt among the indigenous peoples against the French overlords, and was eventually pardoned and lived her days out in southeast London. And she had all the bottom rungs kicked out and yet remained a powerful human being. It was more valuable to her to be herself because she had achieved self-actualization. Once you've got self-actualization, they can starve you, and you might well be one of those people who says, okay, burn me at the stake then. I am me. I will not become somebody else to save my life. So I think that critique is 100% correct, but it's not a critique of Maslow's ladder as I understand its meaning.
Yep, makes sense.
Okay, Dave, do you want to?
Yes, question about variety. I think it's probably too big a question for this meeting, but it's something I've been struggling with in various ways. So how do different ways of organizing relate to commoning? And there's plenty of real life examples with people who contact us and say, we are building commons, let's work together. And you have a look and it turns out they're building community land trusts or cooperatives. And the question is, can we use the tools and ideas we're developing with them, or are we actually in competition with them for investment and customers, etc.?
So the nice thing about where I'm at the moment that I'm proposing here is that, of course, they're commoning because it's just this thing that humans always do. There are different ways of doing it, and so at one level, we're in harmony with them, they're commoning for pro-social intent and with design, as they're approaching it through a design lens. They're trying to think of ways of building pro-social commons in capitalism, and so we are absolutely in many ways shoulder to shoulder with them. But if you think of it as different architects have got different propositions for the town hall. Somebody in the end is going to choose one of the designs for the town hall. So in a sense, those architects are in competition. But the best way for one of those architects to win the competition is probably to have built 7 other really nice buildings, so that people can look at the pretty picture they've drawn and say, yes, but they've actually managed to make 7 other pretty pictures turn into really good buildings, as opposed to these people who've only made 1 pretty picture. So I think we don't need to directly compete with them. We need to, it's the Buckminster Fuller thing. We need to build some nice things and say, well, you judge, we think these are good. And there's a lot of space out there. There's a whole capitalist world to bring healthy things to. So yeah, I think we can not worry too much. We're so small, we're not really competing that hard with anybody at the moment. But we think we've got some good designs.
Thanks a lot, Dil. That's great. Francois, do you have any question or comment around those?
I was going to say no, but this very last comment that you made, Dil, sparked an alarm in me with the idea there are these hundreds or thousands of people who are competing for different varieties of commoning. I don't think that's what you meant, but that's what it sounded like.
I was saying, let's not compete. Let's just build nice things and hope that people choose us to do things with as a result of us having built some nice things.
Thanks, Dil. Is that okay, Francois?
Yeah. Could go forever otherwise.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to ask any clarifying questions or make a comment?
Yeah, I mean this last, I'll start at the end, and this whole point about collaboration on costs but competition on quality. And I was having a very long conversation the other day with somebody, Isabella Kaminska, who's one of the best brains I've ever come up against, well, not come up against, known. And we were very much focused on this whole area of, you could say, authenticity. And I talk about qualitative easing. And Dil, you and I remember talking in Liverpool about the quality of the relationship, right? That we're going to go to a relationship and to the quality of services rather than the quantity of objects. I think that's a huge point. And this, again, this takes us to Pirsig and the metaphysics of quality, which is if I have a guiding light in my life, that's what it is. It's the metaphysics of quality and the metaphysics of value. So that's one point or one thought. And the other one, of course, you referred to again is it's about the collective, and it's about incorporation. And this is where identity comes into it. If you have a legal, and I would think of it as an unnatural. See, you've got natural persons, real persons, and unnatural persons, which is what a corporate body is, at least on the face of it. And within that unnatural, agreement, you lose your identity. This is the key point. You lose your identity, and people on the outside of that corporate, and even the people within it, become alienated from it. And the other problem is, of course, in order to act in the real world, you have to have a natural person acting on behalf of an unnatural person, and that person has a divergence of has a conflict of interest, the famous principal agency problem. So for me, the whole art, well, not so much the art, my search for this legal holy grail, which I think I've sort of found, or not a million miles away, is to have a corporate which is open. I mean, we talked about open corporates long since. But I think then you're looking at something which is associative, a corporate within which you maintain your identity. And I think that is, for me, fundamental, that that we are able to do that, and therefore develop a sort of a living system of protocol, legal protocols to go with the machine protocols, to create these legal protocols. And I've thought that for a long time, as you know, but it's only in the last 6 months to a year, or maybe even less, that I've finally found all the little legal building blocks and tiny little last blue pieces in the sky, in the jigsaw sky, but to actually, finish that. So I've never been happier that there is a solution which is completely mutual, that doesn't require any relationship with the existing system other than what we want to have. I'm absolutely convinced of it, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm so happy to be talking to this group, because we're here, we've all got identity, we are a collective, but we're still open. And I'll stop there because I'm getting carried away. And this is Dil, this is your, this is for you, and I really respect everything that you're saying here. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to have you. Yeah. And yeah, well, that's Sue.
Yes. Do you want to continue then, Dil? I'm going to pass. I'm not
You
going to
might
make
have
any...
had a point on that one, though. Sorry.
No, I don't want to make any comment
Okay.
or question.
So what I'm going to do now, so as I said, this is also potentially going to turn into a 45-minute one-person talk if I do it at Kairos, and also into a couple of thousand words in Henry Levison's magazine. So I might be able to expand it. But what I'm going to do is sort of
can I just mention, Dil, that we've actually got 15, not 45?
50. No.
You're being a
45
spoil
minutes is the
understand.
kind
You're being
of
a
thing.
spoil sport, so
I know there's only 15 minutes, so what I'm gearing up to is saying I'm just going to cherry pick a couple of these things, and what I want to do is just remind ourselves of these lenses: scale, formality, characterizing the interdependence, and variety, and look at just a couple of these life experiences of mine and talk about them. So I'm going to talk about being in a band. So a band is definitely a common activity, and the bands that I were in, and eventually one that was actually sort of vaguely serious, although never made any money or anything like that, we never formalized anything. We were forced to formalize things at some point. We had suddenly got sent a contract, and we had to just sort of, we agreed that we were all joint authors of everything that we produced. I think that was the only formal thing we ever did that was not mandated by some external bureaucratic process. And yet, so being in a band is a very interesting commoning thing. You're a band and the audience are not the band. There's a definite, people get thrown out of bands. People, argue for a long time before you let someone join a band. You can't, we didn't have a songwriter. We all made the stuff, and you can probably tell that when you're listening to it. But I'm not recommending you do. And it emerged from us all doing the thing we wanted to do, and we didn't give up because the others did what they did in a way that didn't piss us off too much. Honestly, it was very, yeah. So I'm just interested to think about that in terms. So scale, it was tiny. The serious band I was in, it were 3 people, and we actually liked being 3. Formality, it was extraordinarily informal. We weren't even really mates down the pub much. 2 of us were sometimes. Characterizing the interdependence. There was enormous interdependence. We got up on stage in front of strangers in foreign countries and acted like they ought to have paid to come and see us and that they should listen to us. And yet, 2 of us couldn't really play. We'd learned by doing. We all just, we didn't rehearse that much. We all just expected that it would somehow work. And so there was this sort of extraordinary interdependence at one level, but totally, we didn't, it's very odd. And when we split up, we just split up. We don't go to the pub. We only talk about reissues of the records or things like that. Variety. It's pretty simple. When you're in a band, everybody knows everything about the shape of the space you're in. And you've only got to play songs or make noise, honestly, and fit into the venue and make a record. So actually, there was almost no variety there. We were able to, so yeah, and I'll shut up and just because I see if anyone's got anything to say about that experience.
Okay, Katja, you're first.
Don't
I
really
mean,
have that much to say other than it's
there
quite
there might not
interesting.
be much because I mean you weren't there and I was there and I've characterized it, so I realize maybe this is not a very interesting one to share, but it's an interesting formative experience for me around realizing I was commoning but didn't know anything about commoning at the time and didn't consider it that way.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. Yeah.
Chris?
No, it's okay. You don't need to sign one of your albums for me, Dil. Don't
Don't
worry.
worry. We never made an album. Okay, so I'm gonna come much more into where we're all at, so that actually I don't need to explain, I guess, and then that would be quite interesting. So I'm going to go straight to the housing commons, I think, or maybe via the let scheme. I don't know how long we got. I might just go. I don't know. It might be interesting to talk Brixton let scheme. Both Sue and I had considerable involvement at different times in that history of Brixton lets. So, Sue, would you like to look at lets through those lenses of scale, formality, the type of independence and variety, or would you not?
I can be relatively quick about it, I think.
Okay.
Scale, I think, is really important because out of that and also local exchange and trade schemes, we've learned that what you have to do is to create a small enough and large enough group and time and space that it's trustworthy. There's no point. In fact, exchange often doesn't happen. And if it becomes really trustworthy, like it did with the babysitters, they don't even bother to put into the account system. So I think that's really important. The formality, the acknowledgement of it is, for me, one of the difficulties is that people have a background experience and mindset and learning and schooling, for want of a better word, of how they ought to exchange and trade. And so they were also always looking at how could I get it from what do I sell into the market? What job do I get? It wasn't about what can I offer? And my experience in Egypt outside tourism is nothing has a cost until someone wants to buy and someone wants to sell. And I think that formality needs to melt into a different way of us understanding. And because it's people that are doing it, I think that's really important. The interdependence at the moment, particularly this side of the planet, we've really learned how to be independent. And to become interdependent is almost our next step of consciousness, for want of better words. And also learning so that you're not completely independent and you're not completely dependent, but actually it's an exchange. And I'm not sure that we even know what that looks like or feels like in a way in local exchange and trade schemes I'm talking about. And the variety, there were so many different local exchange and trade schemes. It was amazing. In fact, someone created, what was his name? Michael Linton created an account system for it. And he forgot to tell everyone, you've got to do it my way. And so everyone modified the system. And he says, I can't do anything more with it now. I can't update it or anything because you've all changed it. So fascinating in terms of variety. Does that help at all, Dil?
No, that's great. It's really good for it not to be me chuntering on, and that really interesting observations. I think, yeah.
Can we go to housing commons now?
I think we probably should. And again,
Yes.
it might be really good to maybe what we could do with housing commons is do a round on each of those four lenses and just give everybody, but we probably have to be quite quick.
Yeah.
Katya, I know because you're with Bristol Commons. I don't know if you have housing commons there. Do you want
No,
to?
there's a big interest in the topic. And we met up like one from Bristol Commons, one other person from Bristol Commons, and me. We had a meeting with Stroud Commons, and that was really interesting discussing it. So there's certainly interest. Yeah. And if I should go, I would pick scale and say it could potentially become quite big. So more in terms of scaling out, so not big houses or something, but yeah, people picking up the ideas and yeah, setting up housing commons in other towns, and then also within a town it could grow. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Katya. Chicken Dave, are your brains in gear yet, or
I
comments, or?
can talk a little bit more on the scale.
Uh-huh.
The I feel like the reason why I'm involved in the Commons in the first place is because it has the most potential to scale. And housing commons, if the barriers for scaling, there are many barriers, I think, but one of them is the transition of the culture of ownership to seeing it as a different form, as viable as owning, and to build that with evidence, but also with cultural narratives. And then if we can do that and build rails that makes it frictionless for people to adopt, pilot, and create an environment where people could be housed affordably, then yeah, I think it can grow quite quickly. And a lot of my time and thinking outside of my daily work is thinking about, well, what do we need if it does explode? How do we make sure that there is a support mechanism, making sure that it's done well, and um, that it doesn't get co-opted or skewed in a way that then could be damaging to the reputation of the commons. And also, yeah, there's a lot of kind of sort of potential consequences for growing too quickly, and how the commons lab could become the mitigation mechanism for that, and what would it take to make that happen.
Yeah, this
Do
is
you want
exactly what we've been
to
talking about this morning for about 2 or 3 hours.
do you want to reply to that, Dil?
There's just one thing I would like to say about scale, which is that there is the way that the word scale is very often used these days is in the VC culture term of how quickly can you make this model go global and take over the world. I'm thinking more in terms of this lens of looking at a particular commons of something about the right size or the implications of the size of a particular commons for its character. And I'm increasingly interested in a thing which is, I think, comes up in a few scientific contexts, which is characteristic scale, which is that things have certain size relationships and they're sort of set by the nature of themselves, and that if you go outside those size relationships, it stops working, or it can't function, or it becomes something else. So I'm it's more about there's a JBS Haldane essay called On Being the Right Size about biology, which is, I think, beautiful to read, very short, and what I'm trying more to get at here with scale.
Thanks very much. Francois, do you want to have a look at one of these characteristics in relation to housing commons?
What's not quite clear to me, as I'm not very well versed in the housing, in things housing, but what's not clear to me what the difference is between a housing commons and a co-housing community, or a housing cooperative. All of these, and they must. I don't know whether these are just variations of the same things, or whether they're fundamentally different.
I mean, very briefly, they've got a fundamental difference in that what we try and do in the housing commons model is bring together the funders of the purchase of the house as commoners, tenants as commoners, and stewards as commoners into a win-win-win context. So they've got different rights and responsibilities with regard to the estate of houses and the finances pertaining to those, but that they're all getting value out of it, which they could not get if the others weren't willing to participate, and that they therefore can hopefully find it worth the collaboration effort to participate and grow the commons. So there's a radical distinction between this housing commons model and most other housing, even progressive housing approaches. There are things like Chiemgauer in Germany, not Chiemgauer, what's it called? Mietshäuser in Germany, which have commonalities. Mietshäuser, not Mietshäuser.
Mietshäuser Syndikat.
Yeah, that's it.
Katja, did you want to add it in?
Should I in the chat?
No, that's okay. Francois, did you want to come back on that, or was that
No,
perfect?
no, that's very interesting. I leave it. Thank you.
Okay. So Chris, I realize we're slightly over time. And also, really, personally, I recognize that there's a lot more that we need to chat about. However, Chris, do you want to have a look at one of these characters in relation to housing commons?
There's so much to say, isn't there? And I've been looking at this for 20 odd years. But I sort of come back to a thought about how the rules, the institutions determine the instruments in some ways. You know, if you're setting out to play football, then a round ball of a certain size, you wouldn't use a golf ball and you wouldn't use a beach ball, for instance. You know, with the rules of the game, because you can pass it with your feet, and the goal, you don't want an ice hockey goal, and you don't want to go all the way across the pitch. So the instruments sort of come about from the rules of the game, and I think that's the same with property as well. There's a very interesting architect I worked with, James Simpson, in up here in Edinburgh, and he spoke very interestingly about how the tenements were determined by the property law up here, and the fact and I heard similar things said about the Georgian buildings when you had 99-year leases and so on, and then you get into co-housing and the fact that you've got private spaces and personal spaces, and how 15% of new Danish building is co-housing, and how actually that's having done it myself, it's a bloody good model for a developer in that it squeezes a lot of money out of people, but equally for the people who are there, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So it is, by God, it's complex, and the whole question of variety and the different forms of tenure, and having been in a fully mutual co-op myself, that was the least cooperative co-op on the planet, bar none. And yet, and yet it's a superb system if you get it right. And coming back to, there's a really interesting fundamental point, Dil, which you and I need to have a proper blether about, I think, because it's something that's intrigued me for 20 odd years. And it only just recently, I think I've cracked it. And that is that we have a limit on leases in Scotland of 20 years. And typically in England and Wales, 20 odd years comes into it as well. The Jesmond project I was involved in, they didn't have a lease more than 21 years. And if you look at a piece of work that John Law did, John Law proposed a system. It was genius to actually monetize land. And it was about 20 years purchase of land. And another angle is there's a guy I've had a backwards and forwards dispute with or argument with, but he was pointing out that 20 years rent is typically typically there or thereabouts the value of the typical house. And I know that Dil was not a million miles off with the work he's been doing. And it made me think, where does this 20 years come from? What is the fundamental reason that in our relationships, where does it come from? And
is it a characteristic scale? Yeah.
But in terms of the holistic economy, I think I've actually come up with a reason why within the viable system, the reason why it is 20 years. But that's for discussion another time.
Indeed. Yeah.
But it's taken me a long, long time for the penny to drop. And all
You
of the
tease
work
you.
Yeah, I've got to go somewhere else, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
You can carry on.
Anyway, well, thank you guys for such a, and not just, it's not entertaining. It's way more than entertaining. Thought-provoking and stimulating conversations. And pleasure to be here.
Well,
thanks for your reflections, Chris, and Dil. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sue, for
what you provided.
facilitating.
But mostly, I hope the reciprocal is that it's created an environment for you to move on to Kairos with this as well.
I think it's going to be, I'm very grateful to all of you for all of your comments and thoughts and letting me do that in such an experimental way with you. But yeah, great.
Yeah.
Cheers,
Thanks
Dil.
very much.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.